Okay, so hello everyone. So my name, as John said, is Ciara Cummins. So I'm currently working in the Central Statistics office in Ireland. So I suppose our headquarters is based in County Cork, and we have two other offices in County Dublin in Ireland. So essentially today what we kind of want to show you essentially is I suppose our introduction into utilising the DDI Data Documentation Initiative standard through using the Colectica's tools. So essentially just kind of bring you through, I suppose, how we're using it at the questionnaire design and kind of the data collection element of our process in the CSO. So just for, I suppose, anyone who doesn't know what this CSO stands for, it's really just the Central Statistics Office, and really it's Ireland's National Statistics Office. So essentially the purpose of the CSO is to collect, analyse and disseminate the statistics about Ireland's people, society and economy. So really, I suppose we're coming from a bit of a different perspective with the DDI standard in the sense that I suppose we are the NSI of Ireland, the National Statistics Institute, and essentially we are responsible, I suppose, for the entire life cycle and the production of a statistical product. So I suppose right from the design, the specify needs stage, right through to the disseminate and evaluate stage. So I suppose that might come a bit evident throughout the presentation. So me myself, I'm currently working in the Quality Management Support and Assurance division, and my current role at the moment is responsibility for managing and governing the rollout of the Colectica tool, and I suppose trying to really embed the tool as kind of a corporate tool in the sense of business as usual, as opposed to kind of the developmental introduction phase that we're on at the moment, and also just alongside that kind of working with classifications and the standard section in the Central Statistics Office. So I suppose that's kind of the background, and just give you kind of an overview on the presentation today. I just hope to kind of give a background into how our data collection process, I suppose, was before. So, a few years back as such. And I suppose just kind of to illustrate some of the work that we're doing and the transition that we're moving to a more kind of systematic approach through utilising the DDI international standard and through Colectica. So with that, then we'll just give a live demo, I suppose, of some of the work that we've done in terms of the standardisation of questions, kind of trying to build up our question bank across surveys over time. Same with the standardisation of code lists, and just kind of some of the work that has been progressed with that. And finally, we'll just touch on some of the future aims, I suppose, for our metadata management. So as we're kind of just on this journey at the moment, by no means there, I suppose, but I suppose we have progressed a lot. So there's still, future aims that we have as well. So just give you kind of a brief insight in terms of the data collection and our survey design process as it was before. So previously, I suppose, the subject matter expert in our social statistics sections, social statistics in this case being those that are responsible for the household data collection. So all their social surveys that go out to households and to the fields had the responsibility of designing and creating questionnaires for their own statistical product. So essentially, the one statistician, or the one person over the statistical product, was responsible for designing both the questions, concepts, variables, as well as doing kind of the analysis and the analysis and processing phase, and then disseminating the statistic and the results at the end of the process. So essentially, statisticians kind of applied their own knowledge and their experience into the survey design, and produced questionnaire specs for the IT team to develop. IT team, those responsible for compiling the tablets and developing the questionnaire so that it can go out in the field for the interviewers. So with this process and having kind of, I suppose, the one person responsible for all, it did have kind of its own disadvantages of designing surveys in this way. So some of the drawbacks include the inconsistency in the survey design. So there was no kind of standard or standardisation in the sense of how questionnaires and surveys were actually being designed and being created and published. And with that then as well, there was kind of poor documentation across the statistical process. So, you're kind of very person dependent on how people do things and that kind of way. There was no kind of real standard process in how we did it. And with that as well, there was kind of inconsistent survey specifications provided to Blaise. So a very kind of silo effect in the sense of how things were given to our Blaise team. And that in itself, I suppose, comes with its drawbacks. And one of the key fundamental things was there was no kind of final version of what went out in the field. And I suppose that was one of kind of the key game changers as such, in the sense that, you know, everyone, you do need to know what exactly went out, what questions it included, what response categories, etc. So that was kind of, you know, it might be stored on people's personal, their own desktop, or, you know, personnel changes, it's trying to find, I suppose, what the final one was, etc. So had a few limitations in that way. And just continue on with that, then I suppose historic questionnaires were stored across multiple Word documents, and Blaise code formats as such. So again, you can imagine, I suppose, just the different the formats and the inconsistency in terms of the layouts there as well. So again, some of the implications around that was in terms of identifying what questions were used and what exactly worked, was quite difficult, and how to identify the linkage between questions across multiple surveys. So I suppose one, as I'll draw back in a few minutes, I suppose, one of the key things is trying to introduce standardization of similar questions across similar surveys. And obviously when they are in kind of quite diverse documents and, you know, in different places, that was quite hard to do. So even just, for example, with, I suppose, interviewers asking questions on names, you know, sometimes it could have been in different ways. So that was kind of a problematic. And then just outputting survey specifications to field staff and data users. Obviously when it was spread across different people, more time consuming to develop a survey, and error prone with no kind of traceability revisions or version controls. So obviously when something changes over time, or changes from next iteration to the next period to the next, whatever, is quite hard to track then changes. So essentially, basically our motivation then behind changing our approach was from some of the ambitions that are listed below, but essentially we kind of got introduced to the whole idea of DDI standard, so the Data Documentation International Standard. And I suppose at the time of our motivation to change, just due to resources and things, we didn't have, I suppose, the capacity to really, you know, kind of develop our own things. But what we wanted to do was to develop a central repository for standard and reusable questions. So to try and start identifying exactly what questions were, you know, being used, stored in one place, and build this question bank over time, that we can start reusing them due to commonality and standardization. It was also to allow a platform, I suppose, for all involved in the process to review and to discuss. So as you can imagine, there's kind of a lot of different like parties, depending on whether you're on the data collection side of things, the results and analysis side. So to actually have this kind of visibility on what's going on and what questions are being used, both even internally and externally for researchers and data users as well. And also just to standardize content and improve metadata across social surveys. So to actually, you know, get more information around the questions, such as, you know, proper naming conventions, labels, you know, instructions around it, and try to standardize and improve this amount of metadata over time. Approve the survey documentation and reporting. So one of the key things, obviously, standardize the output of documents in order to give the same look and feel onto our outputs to Blaise, to researchers, to data users, etc. And I suppose fundamentally as well, to reduce the workload and the burden for our IT team. So in, say, Blaise, the questionnaire design unit, and the relevant subject matter experts. So I suppose in very late 2017, we, as I just said, I suppose we had the capacity to build our own software. So we kind of went off the shelf approach, and we kind of invested into the Colectica applications in very late 2017. So I suppose just to kind of highlight, we have purchased kind of the repository, the Colectica Portal, which I'll show you in just a couple of minutes, Colectica Designer and Colectica Questionnaires, which are really just the tools in order to use to get the data up there into the repository and onto our portal. So just with this kind of, you know, new approach, which I'll go through, the stakeholders involved. So as this transition to a more systematic approach has been developed, there was a questionnaire design unit has been established, who are solely now responsible for the designing of the questionnaires and the questions and everything that goes with it in terms of filters, conditions, etc. So I suppose the responsibility has kind of gone away from the statistician responsible for the entire product, and they're kind of at the next phase, then are kind of the process and analysing stage. So the questionnaire design unit is solely responsible for questionnaires. Then we have the IT and Blaise team, who are obviously very much in the process, with the subject matter expert who, you know, must define their variables and their concepts and what they actually want to collect. And then we have ourselves, well, myself and my colleagues, well, quality unit, who are kind of the overseer of kind of the process, and the administrators of, I suppose, the Colectica product, and ensure standardisation, ensure kind of governance of how this new approach works, and just kind of be there as a support for them as well. So I suppose, just as kind of a nutshell, before I go into the demo, I suppose this kind of new process then, so the questionnaire development process now really kind of mirrors that of the GSPPM, so the generic statistical business process model, but also kind of the DDI life cycle, and on how things move from the next phase, and how it's not just a linear process. So basically, when we start off with kind of specifying needs, our questionnaire design unit team and the subject matter experts agree the survey requirements and specifications that they want in their survey. Then that goes ahead then, and the design and build phase happens with the questionnaire design unit developing the survey using really dependent on the Colectica questionnaires then, in order to create this, where they can access the question bank and everything that goes with it. And I suppose obviously that's not kind of always linear, so that can kind of go back and over until SMEs are happy that everything is going to be collected for their needs. Then it goes on to kind of when QTU are going through the design phases, say, and they output Blaise code that Colectica can output, as well as the survey specs, which again we're quite heavily dependent on it for IT to go ahead and build the survey themselves and for the tablets. So then the IT, I suppose, Blaise create and test the questionnaire for the field, and obviously the testing is both QTU and the IT. So again, that's backward compatible as well, until everyone's happy that it's ready to go out in the field. Then we go through kind of the collect and the analyse phase, where the data returns into the SQL tables, which are then cleaned and processed. We go through kind of the disseminate phase, where obviously for the statistician responsible, they're going actually publishing externally. But for ourselves, I suppose it's trying to get the data files that came back in imported back into the repository to really kind of test how the question worked. And I suppose for today's purpose anyway, it's just kind of the data collection side of things, but I suppose that's where we're progressing to anyway. And then at the evaluate stage, we have the fundamental thing is the final version of the survey is determined, and that's published onto the repository where we can see exactly what was asked, and it's usable again for the next iteration of the next survey or whatever. So just kind of moving on, I suppose I'll just go and show you kind of the Colectica portal. So essentially at the moment, this is just internally viewable it's viewable only internally inside the CSO, with the intention, I suppose, in the next couple of weeks and you know, in the near future, to get this published externally. I suppose as I go through it, there is a lot of information there that's of interest to both our users of data, kind of other DDI users, metadata experts, etc. So I suppose that's kind of the key goal now in the next couple of weeks. But essentially, I suppose anyone who is aware of DDI will be familiar, I suppose, with the terms. But you have kind of the series and the studies and the instruments, and as I say, kind of we're just kind of touching on the work in terms of the data files and the variables. But essentially, for ourselves with the series, it kind of, as it is a statistical section that with repeated set of studies. For ourselves, it's kind of mirrors that of like at a division level as well, which has a lot of studies underneath it that are repeating studies underneath. So I'll just kind of step through some of the series, and I suppose with this whole approach, I suppose the fundamental motivation behind this approach really was to, again, start standardising around the questions, around the code lists that are being used, getting the documentation and stuff in place, which I suppose luckily for us, Colectica provides that. So we have kind of like the different series at this level, so business statistics, kind of our census collection, general household survey, growing up in Ireland, which I suppose is just which its responsibility at the moment is still being kind of conducted by the ERSI in Ireland, but we just kind of started that journey of documenting them. Questionnaires, the income and consumption and wealth, labour market analysis, social analysis and social data collection. So as we kind of dive in to this, we have, I suppose, just kind of we could add, I suppose, as much as little metadata at this level. But essentially, we've just kind of kept it clean at the moment in terms of the title, what it is, the abstract purpose, I suppose, of the series, kind of the universe in terms of what it actually measures. So the Irish population, using the census sample, quality statements, just kind of added for extra metadata. And I suppose just with the LFS in particular, it's conducted every quarter in Ireland, so Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, across 5 different waves, and essentially as a repeated study, we've grouped it into like an annual series. So I suppose just in 2019, just to kind of show, we have added, I suppose, some of the data that came from the questionnaires, and underneath you have the different data collections, which sense is the different times in which it was collected. But I suppose just to keep it relevant, we'll keep it with 2020. So within here, I suppose you just have some information about the different quarters. So Q1, Q2, Q3, and our Q4 is just going live at the moment, but we've captured the instrument here as obviously was used to actually develop the survey. So I suppose within, and just as I mentioned, I suppose some of the information on the methodology of the LFS, time periods in which it's collected, sampling procedure, and again, I suppose as we evolve this application, we'll be populating this data, metadata over time, as well as, I suppose, to mention some of the extra metadata packages where we can add information on kind of the variables and extra Eurostat documentation or whatever you want to add there. So essentially, just in terms of the questionnaire development, then we can very easily view the instrument then through this the portal and the application, and this is quite a large survey. So I suppose just for those not familiar with Colectica, this is just what it kind of looks like. So we can kind of drill through each of the blocks within the LFS, and very easily we're kind of capturing information, notes around the questionnaire. We have all the questions that reside underneath, as well as the filters that need to be met in order for the question to be asked. Now, I'm conscious kind of it's a simplistic block, but introduction block really, and depending on the wave that this will be asked. We have different things then, kind of as I mentioned about the version control. So we have kind of the list of our different versions, our DDI identifiers, the agencies, kind of information around who it's updated by, the rationale in terms of why it was added or why it was amended even, and kind of go through our full history within here and our rationales, and we can go through the older kind of revisions, as well as, I suppose, downloading, as I mentioned, one of the key motivators as well around the documentation of using this application, and DDI as well as obviously the rich source of information that you get from the PDFs. So I suppose I can show you before I open up anything else. I suppose some of a sample of what comes out really is, this is like the paper form version that we now use, capturing all the questions and all the display logics which are used out in the field for your researchers or anyone who needs a copy of the paper form, and then a more technical spec, for a better word, for our IT and Blaise team, because obviously this is a bit more informative, a bit clunky in terms of the nitty-gritty of the question in terms of Blaise instructions, a lot of more metadata for anyone who wants to use it, obviously. But as I say, it's quite heavily dependent for our Blaise IT for compiling the questionnaires. So as such then, as I say, one of the key things then around this utilising DDI was around standardisation and standardisation of the questions that we're asking. So one of the first place we started was around kind of common questions that are asked around common household surveys. So for example, your demographic block. And in this case, it's really start thinking about, and by using these tools to start saying, start asking questions that are common across the surveys, as I said. So for example, in many of the cases with these social surveys, it's the same interviewers that are asking the questions to respondents. So it was important to start, asking them in the same way where possible. So for example, around name, surname, may I ask your first name, please? May I ask your surname? And at least this is concrete in terms of the standard way of asking it. And so this is the way it is in the LFS, it's the way it'll be in the Silk. the household budget survey, and so on. So it's not, you know, may I ask your name in one? Can I ask your name in the other? What is your name in somewhere else? So it's important, I suppose, to capture that commonality. And I suppose just as a glimpse here, at a question level is so just extra metadata around the name. So the name underscore. We have the label, which carries through across the whole life cycle and the DDI life cycle. We have a few Blaise instructions. So although we're trying to be transparent in the output of Blaise that comes from Colectica, we also just add it in as a note, just in case Blaise ever need to come back and identify, you know, that double check it based on the technical spec. So we have the question text, may I ask your first name? And what we see from here then is that I suppose this same exact question is asked across various different social surveys. So for example, so it's usage, say the household financial consumption survey, the sexual violence survey pilot. We have different levels of the LFS, so Q1 and Q2, say the national travel survey, the new kind of yes for the integrated European statistical standard survey. We have SILK, and then another household budget survey. But essentially what it is it's the same kind of question that is used, again, the exact same way across all these various surveys. And I suppose by utilising, again, the DDI and the Colectica tools, it's very easy to see that, and it's quite produce the commonality. So as another example is just around the surname. And I suppose just some of the work that we're doing with that as well is to push that standardisation and commonality. So I suppose just to mention as well, I suppose just on the left we can see again all the series in the study and the lineage this way as well. So sorry, I don't know if you see that, but and the instruments then that are attached. And I suppose just in kind of one instance is, well, here I suppose there's just more Blaise instructions, but again, question text, label, the name, and all the questionnaires that use this exact question. But also I suppose some of the work that we're just kind of scratching the surface on at the moment as well is this link with the variables. And I suppose when I just have pre-open there just in case. So in this case, I suppose it's what we're trying to get at is the different ways in which we can ask kind of the same questions, and then obviously to push the standardization. But in this case, we have kind of the variable and the concept around age. So it's age in completed years, variable name D3. And we can very easily see the source of questions that have been used to ask the source question of age. So for example, in the above surveys here, we have, you know, date of birth. Could you tell me your date of birth? So that's still capturing the concept age. Then we have kind of estimate of age. So still asking about age, but just in a different way, used by the above surveys. Could you tell me your age? Then we've another instance of it in terms of the month of birth. So although it's a different question, still asking the concept of age. And we have the household person details. So again, in this particular case, the household budget survey have just accumulated, can you tell me the name, date of birth, and sex in this case. So I suppose it's just in terms of, again, where we're going to process is it's trying to get that lineage of kind of how we can develop and use questions over time. So again, the concept of age and the 4 different ways we can use to ask it. And in some cases, I suppose they're asked in multiple different, like 2 of them might be used in the same survey based on filters and conditions and how we get to asking the question. But I suppose it's just the powerful, the usefulness of, I suppose, how we're using the product and of DDI. So one of the other things then is just around the standardization then of the code lists. So again, just trying to use the same code list across multiple different surveys. So again, this is quite a simplistic example, but we have, you know, 1 for yes and 2 for no, and this exact code list is used then across 397 surveys. And again, it might be simplistic, but again, as we try and develop use over time, it'll be similar to the classification use of, you know, mortgages and occupation and education and things like that. So I suppose, yeah, the rest, that's just another example in terms of the use of the classifications. And yeah, I suppose as we try and develop to kind of use the concepts and yeah, the conceptual variables, as Hilda kind of mentioned in her presentation, it's kind of we'll be developing the use of that as well on Colectica. So just kind of finally, I suppose, as I say, move towards this new approach, some of the challenges faced, and again, I suppose we don't introduce anything new or project without facing some challenges, is really just the change in process results in the change of mindset for, both ourselves, for statisticians within the CSO, and just introducing anything kind of type new. So the statisticians, I suppose, have transitioned from what was once kind of designing and giving the questions to now providing the variables and concepts to the questionnaire design unit. So that's all kind of relatively new, as well as kind of using the new tools and processes. I suppose it's always a continual challenge to enforce and to govern the standards on how we do things. And I suppose that's kind of the same for everyone really. And around the training requirements, so based on change of personnel, whether it's kind of the new updates and things like that, it's continuously trying to train and better ourselves by using these standards and tools. And I suppose finally then just kind of our future aims, as I mentioned, is just around the disseminating of a public facing portal for both our researchers and CSO data users. It's around kind of advancing the work on the data discoverability side of things. So very much today, it's focused on the data collection element, but I suppose we're conscious of moving it towards the disseminate and evaluate stage to really utilise both the standard and Colectica functionality, and kind of to utilise again the ability of producing the code books and SIMS quality reports through Colectica and DDI, and to continue and then always continue with standardising the use of the questions, the variables and the code list used across all surveys. So I suppose that's kind of it in a crash course there anyway, but I suppose thank you for listening anyway, and if anyone has any questions,